The call. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the neighborhood as Officer Michael Rodriguez steered his patrol car down a long, narrow street. His eyes flicked from the rearview mirror to the cracked pavement beneath them, aware of the surrounding area's dilapidated state. Old buildings, once vibrant, now stood like hollowed-out shells, their paint faded and chipped. The smell of the city's sweat and decay clung to the air, carried by a light breeze that did little to alleviate the oppressive heat. Sitting beside him in the passenger seat, Officer Robin Fisher wiped the sweat from her brow and took a sip of water from her bottle. "Pretty quiet today," she remarked, her voice relaxed, but always alert. Michael nodded, his fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel. "Yeah, almost too quiet. Makes you wonder what's brewing beneath the surface." The silence stretched between them as they cruised through the streets, the hum of the car's air conditioning offering a small comfort against the oppressive heat. Michael had been a cop long enough to know that silence was sometimes a warning, a prelude to something more dangerous lurking just out of sight. "Still, it's nice to have a breather after last week," Robin continued, her eyes scanning the row of houses that looked like they might collapse at any moment. "I've had enough of all those domestic disturbances." Michael glanced at her and offered a half smile, appreciative of the camaraderie. "Yeah, those are the worst. At least this feels manageable." But the serenity wouldn't last. As if to prove his point, the radio crackled to life with an urgent message from dispatch. The calm was shattered in an instant, and both officers leaned forward as the words cut through the stillness like a cold wind. "Attention all units in the vicinity of Oakwood. We've received a 911 call that needs immediate investigation." A young boy's voice, very faint, says only "send help" before the line went dead. "We've pinged the location from the cell tower. The address is 1542 Sycamore Street." Michael's stomach dropped. He knew that street. It wasn't the safest area in town, and it wasn't one he liked visiting, especially not with a young child involved. "Did they get any other details?" Robin asked, her fingers automatically tapping the console to bring up the address on the car's GPS. "No other details, but it's close. We're only a few blocks away." Michael turned the wheel with a sharp motion, his eyes fixed on the growing tension in Robin's expression. They both knew how serious it could be when a child was involved, especially with so little information. Robin's hand instinctively hovered near her holstered weapon as the siren sounded, cutting through the lazy afternoon noise of the neighborhood. "Let's move," she said, urgency clear in her tone. Michael responded with a sharp nod, his heart quickening as he pressed the gas pedal. The sound of the sirens seemed to amplify in the quiet streets, almost as if they too were alert to the gravity of the situation. The neighborhood they were entering seemed increasingly rundown, its streets littered with abandoned cars, overgrown yards, and houses in various stages of collapse. Everything about this place spoke of years of neglect and decay. "I've got a bad feeling about this one," Robin muttered, her hand resting lightly on her weapon as they maneuvered the car through a series of potholes and debris scattered across the street. Michael couldn't help but agree. "Stay sharp. If there's a kid in trouble, every second counts." As they neared 1542 Sycamore Street, Michael's eyes narrowed, the house coming into view. It was as bad as he imagined. A crumbling structure with peeling paint, missing windows, and sagging porch steps. The yard was a mess of weeds and trash, the remnants of a life that seemed long abandoned. An old refrigerator lay discarded on its side near the curb, its door hanging open like the mouth of a beast. "Jesus," Robin muttered under her breath as they came to a stop. Michael's stomach churned. This wasn't the kind of place anyone should be living, let alone a child. He glanced at his partner, who was already moving toward the door, hand on her holstered weapon. "Stay alert," he said quietly, his voice low and tense. They approached the front door cautiously, Michael's instincts on high alert. Robin knocked firmly on the weathered wood, calling out, "Police. Is anyone home? We received a call for help at this address." Please come to the door." The silence that greeted them felt unnerving. Michael strained his ears, listening for any sounds from inside. The only thing he could hear was the distant hum of the city's heartbeat and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. "Hello," Robin called again, louder this time. "This is the police. If anyone's inside, please come to the door." Still, there was no answer. Michael exchanged a glance with Robin, his eyes narrowing. This wasn't right. The house looked abandoned, but there was evidence of recent activity in the yard. A rusted tricycle, old toys scattered on the ground. "Let's try the door," Michael said, his voice low and steady. He reached for the handle and turned it, but it refused to budge. "Locked," he muttered, his unease growing. "Let's check the back." They moved around the side of the house, pushing through overgrown bushes and trying to stay quiet. The backyard was just as neglected as the front, filled with piles of garbage and rotting furniture. As they walked, Michael's foot caught on something hidden in the tall grass, sending him stumbling. "You okay?" Robin asked, her hand reaching out to steady him. "Yeah, just tripped," Michael replied, brushing off the embarrassment and crouching to see what had caused his stumble. His breath caught in his throat as he pushed aside the weeds to reveal a rusted tricycle, surrounded by other toys, a broken plastic dump truck, a baseball with faded stitches, a tattered stuffed animal. Robin's face hardened as she crouched beside him. "Those haven't been here long," she said, her voice low. "Someone's been living here recently." Michael's heart skipped a beat. Something's wrong here. He looked back at the house, unease flooding him. "We need to get inside. Now." At the front of the house, Michael keyed his radio, his voice tight with urgency. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247 at 1542 Sycamore. We found evidence of recent child activity, but no response at the door. Request permission to enter the premises." There was a brief pause before the dispatcher replied. "Unit 247. Permission granted. Use caution." Michael exchanged a quick look with Robin, and they moved into position. They were just about to make their entry when the sound of approaching sirens reached their ears. More officers were on the way. "Backup's here," Robin muttered. "Let's do this by the book." The tension in the air was palpable as more patrol cars pulled up, their occupants joining the officers already at the scene. Officer Jensen, a seasoned cop with years of experience, approached and asked, "What's the situation?" Michael quickly filled him in, his voice strained with concern. "We need to get in there ASAP. If there's a kid in trouble, every second counts." Jensen nodded, his expression grim. "Let's move." Everyone took their positions, and Michael steeled himself. Whatever they found inside, it was sure to be bad. His mind raced as he looked at the rundown house, his instincts screaming that time was running out. "We go in on 3, Jensen said, his voice low and authoritative. 1, 2, 3. With a powerful kick, Jensen's boot slammed into the door, sending the old wood splintering inward. The heavy lock tore free from the frame with a sharp crack, and the door flew open. A wave of putrid air poured out, urine, decay, and something far worse. The stench was enough to make Michael gag. "Police," Michael called out, his voice echoing in the stale, dark air inside. "If you're here, call out now. We can help you." Only silence greeted him. The darkness of the house felt suffocating as they stepped inside. Michael's flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating the squalor around them. The kitchen was barely recognizable, every surface covered in grime, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and spoiled food. The refrigerator door was open, its interior a dark, rotting mess. Flies buzzed around piles of garbage, their wings a maddening hum. "This is bad," Robin said, her voice tight. "We need to check every room." "Agreed," Michael replied, his stomach churning as he pushed forward into the living room. The scene there was just as grim. Broken furniture, empty liquor bottles, and piles of drug paraphernalia on the coffee table. "Looks like meth use," Robin observed, her eyes narrowing as she examined the evidence. Michael's mind raced as the horror of the situation began to take shape. The 911 call, the child's voice, and now this house. It was all connected, and he knew it was worse than they could have imagined. "We need to get upstairs," Michael said, his voice grim. "Every second counts." They ascended the creaking staircase, the floorboards groaning under their weight. Every room they checked only added to the sense of dread. More signs of drug use, but no sign of a child. That is, until Michael heard it. The descent. The air inside the house grew heavier as Michael and Robin ascended the narrow staircase, their footsteps muffled by the rotting wood beneath them. The house felt like a prison, its decaying walls pressing in from all sides, a testament to years of abandonment and neglect. Each step they took seemed to echo through the silence, amplifying the dread that had begun to claw at Michael's chest. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and with every passing second, his unease grew. "Be ready for anything," Michael whispered to Robin, his voice low, but the tension unmistakable. His hand rested on the grip of his holstered weapon, though he hoped he wouldn't have to draw it. The upstairs was cloaked in an eerie quiet, too still for comfort, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was hiding something much worse. The beam of his flashlight cut through the murk, illuminating rooms that were as decayed as the rest of the house. Empty walls, cracked mirrors, and rotting carpets. Each room was filled with discarded furniture, old newspapers, and dirty clothes, signs of a life that had long been abandoned. Robin stopped at the first room, pushing the door open slowly, her eyes scanning the interior. The light flickered over a small bedroom, revealing a dusty old bed and an overturned lamp. The room was barren, save for a few tattered toys strewn across the floor. "Nothing here," Robin said softly, moving past him to the next door. Michael nodded, his heart sinking. Each room they passed seemed to tell the same story. Empty, abandoned, lifeless. But then, just as they were about to check the next room, Michael froze. A sound, faint but unmistakable, drifted from above. "Did you hear that?" Michael asked, his voice tight with suspicion. His pulse quickened. Robin paused, her eyes darting around the dim hallway. "Yeah, I heard it too," she replied, her hand now firmly gripping her weapon. It sounded like a voice. It was so soft at first that Michael almost wondered if he had imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. The desperate, fragile voice of a child. "I'm here. Please, help." Michael's breath caught in his throat. The words were barely more than a whisper, but they sent a cold shiver down his spine. He exchanged a look with Robin, both of them now fully alert, every nerve on edge. There was no mistaking it. Someone, a child, was calling for help. "It's coming from above," Michael murmured, his hand already moving toward the stairs leading to the attic. The voice seemed to be coming from there, distant but undeniable. Robin nodded grimly, and without a word, they began to move up the stairs. The air grew colder the higher they climbed, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the downstairs. The staircase creaked under their weight, each step feeling like an eternity as they neared the top. The voice, soft, fragile, and filled with so much fear, seemed to grow louder with each step they took. "Please, help." The voice trembled, a sound so pitiful that it almost broke Michael's heart. They'd reached the top, their flashlights sweeping across the landing. The attic door stood at the far end of the hallway, half hidden behind a pile of old, discarded furniture. Michael's stomach tightened, his instincts telling him that whatever they were about to find on the other side of that door would change everything. He turned the handle and pushed the door open, the hinges squealing in protest. The attic was dark, cluttered with old boxes, forgotten furniture, and the remnants of someone's life. It was as though time had stopped in this space. Nothing had been touched in years, but the faint sound of shuffling, the soft rustling of fabric, was enough to make Michael's blood run cold. They stepped inside cautiously, their flashlights sweeping over the room. It was cramped, the air thick with dust, and the smell of mildew. But it was the corner of the room that caught their attention, a small, hunched figure sitting in the shadows. "Hello," Michael called, his voice trembling slightly despite his efforts to stay composed. "We're here to help." The figure didn't move at first, but as they got closer, the boy's head slowly lifted. Michael's heart lurched in his chest when the boy's face came into view. He looked no older than 8 or 9, his face gaunt and pale, his hair ragged and unkempt. His clothes were little more than rags, and his body, emaciated, bruised, and battered, spoke of neglect beyond imagination. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, his gaze darting between Michael and Robin, as though unsure whether they were a threat or his saviors. "Please," the boy whispered again, his voice raspy and weak. "I'm so scared." Michael's chest tightened as he stepped closer, but Robin held him back with a firm hand. "Don't get too close yet," she said softly. "We don't know if this place is still occupied. Let's clear the room first." Michael nodded, reluctantly tearing his eyes away from the boy's pleading gaze. They moved through the attic cautiously, checking every corner, every shadow, but the space was empty. No one else was there. Finally, Michael turned back to the boy, his voice gentle but firm. "Hey, buddy, it's okay. We're here to help. What's your name?" The boy's eyes flickered up to him, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition, like the boy was trying to remember something. But then the fear took over again, and he shrank back into the corner. "Please, don't let them find me," he whimpered. Michael felt his heart break for the child. He took a step forward, his voice soft and soothing. "We're not going to let anyone hurt you anymore. We're going to get you out of here, okay? Everything's going to be okay." The boy didn't respond, his eyes still wide and full of fear, but Michael could see the faintest glimmer of hope in them. He wasn't sure how long this child had been locked away in this place, but the signs of neglect were impossible to ignore. His ribs were visible through his thin shirt, and his arms and legs were covered in bruises. The boy was starving, dehydrated, and terrified. "We need to get him out of here now," Robin said urgently, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. "We don't know how long he's been here." Michael nodded in agreement. "We need backup. I'll call it in." But just as he reached for his radio, the boy's voice cut through the silence again, this time a little louder, a little more desperate. "Daddy, is that you?" Michael froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice sounded familiar, but it couldn't be. He stepped closer, a cold realization dawning on him. The boy's eyes locked onto Michael's, and recognition flared in his sunken gaze. Slowly, with trembling hands, the boy reached out. "Daddy, I'm Nate." Michael's heart stopped. The name hit him like a freight train. Nate, his son. It couldn't be. It had been years since he had seen his boy, and the child before him was nothing like the healthy, happy boy he remembered. This was a shadow of the son he once knew. "Nate." Michael's voice cracked as he knelt down in front of the boy, his hands trembling. "Is it really you?" The boy nodded weakly, his face contorting with pain as he whispered, "I'm sorry, Daddy. I didn't mean to. I didn't know what to do." The guilt and fear in his voice tore at Michael's heart. This wasn't just a child in danger. It was his own flesh and blood, and the overwhelming guilt of not knowing sooner consumed him. "I'm here, buddy. I'm here now," Michael managed to say, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there, but we're going to get you out of here, okay? You're safe now." But even as Michael spoke those words, his mind raced. How had his son ended up here, in this filthy, decaying house, chained, and left to suffer in isolation? And how had Nate managed to call for help, despite everything? Michael's thoughts were interrupted as he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. Robin was already on the radio, calling in for immediate medical assistance, but Michael wasn't listening anymore. His focus was solely on Nate, his son, his baby, who had been trapped in this nightmare for far too long. "We're going to fix this," Michael promised, his voice low and determined. "I swear to you, Nate, this is where it ends." As the sound of sirens drew closer, Michael felt a mix of emotions flood over him: rage, guilt, sorrow, but most of all, love. This was his son, and no one would ever hurt him again. The nightmare was over, but the fight for justice was just beginning. The revelation. The sirens outside grew louder, a steady reminder of the frantic urgency surrounding Michael as he knelt by Nate's side. Every muscle in his body was taut with a mix of relief and disbelief. His son, the boy he hadn't seen in years, the child who had been torn from his life in the most painful of ways, was here, right in front of him, weak and trembling, but still alive. Michael's heart hammered in his chest as he carefully lifted Nate into his arms. The boy was lighter than he should have been, his tiny frame so frail that it felt like the wind could have knocked him over. Michael tried to stay calm, but his hands shook with the weight of what was happening. It was as if the world had shifted beneath him, turning everything upside down. He had been trained to handle dangerous situations, but this was personal. This was his child. Nate's eyes fluttered weakly, his cracked lips moving, but no words came out. Instead, he clung to Michael's jacket, a silent plea for comfort, for safety. Michael's breath caught in his throat as he gently adjusted his son's position, trying to find a way to hold him that would ease the pain in his own chest. "You're safe now, buddy," Michael whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe. I'm not letting anything happen to you." Robin stood at the doorway of the attic, watching the scene unfold with a quiet intensity. She had seen a lot during her years on the force: danger, violence, despair, but nothing had ever struck her like this. She knew Michael's backstory, knew the pain he carried after his messy divorce from Sarah, but seeing him with his son now, after everything, was something different. Her voice broke through the silence. "Michael, we need to get him out of here. We can't stay much longer. You know that, right?" Michael's eyes never left Nate's fragile form. "I know. I just need a minute." Robin nodded, stepping aside to let Michael gather himself. The clock was ticking. They had no idea how long Nate had been trapped in this house, how much more damage had been done to him. Michael had to fight the urge to stay with his son, to protect him from everything that had brought him to this moment. But duty called. They had to get Nate out of there, and Michael had to be strong. For him. "We've got backup coming," Robin said, her voice steady. "We'll make sure he gets medical help as soon as we get out of here. Let's go." Reluctantly, Michael stood up, cradling Nate gently in his arms. His eyes scanned the room one last time, as if trying to memorize every corner, every shadow. The house seemed to close in on him, its broken walls and rotting beams reflecting a sense of abandonment and despair. But none of that mattered now. The focus was on getting Nate out of here and to safety. As they descended the stairs slowly, Michael's mind raced. He had so many questions, so many things he didn't understand. How had Nate gotten here? How had he managed to survive in such a dire situation? And why hadn't he called for help sooner? His mind flooded with guilt as he replayed every moment since the divorce, every missed opportunity to see his son, to make sure he was okay. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, Jensen and the other officers had already set up a secure perimeter outside, waiting for Michael and Robin to bring Nate out. The urgency in their faces mirrored the weight in Michael's chest. Everyone knew how delicate this situation was, but Michael didn't care about the logistics. His eyes were fixed solely on his son. The moment they stepped out of the front door, a flood of emotions hit Michael. The sunlight felt like a harsh contrast to the darkness they had just escaped, almost blinding in its intensity. He could hear the voices of the officers calling out commands, the sound of ambulances approaching, but none of it mattered to him right now. All that mattered was Nate. Nate, his little boy, who had suffered so much, Who had survived in that dark, hellish house, alone and afraid, for what must have felt like an eternity? Michael's heart shattered as he felt the faint warmth of his son's body, so fragile, so vulnerable. He was here now, in his arms, but what had happened to him in this place? "Michael," Robin called out, snapping him out of his thoughts. "We need to move. Now." Michael nodded, his face grim. He carefully passed Nate to one of the paramedics, trying to keep his hand steady, but the reality of the situation was still sinking in. As the paramedics rushed Nate to the waiting ambulance, Michael turned back toward the house, his eyes scanning the grounds one more time. The neighborhood was still eerily quiet, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. "We need to figure out what happened here," Robin said, her voice full of resolve. "Who did this to him, Michael? And why?" Michael clenched his jaw. "I don't know, but I'll find out. I won't stop until I do." But as he stood there, watching the paramedics work, Michael couldn't shake the sense that the answers weren't going to be easy to find. His son had been taken from him once already. Now, it seemed, he was being forced to relive the nightmare of his own past. Broken homes, fractured relationships, and deep, unhealed wounds. But as he looked at Nate, now safely in the hands of the medical team, something else stirred in him, a powerful surge of protectiveness. He had made a promise to his son, and he was going to keep it, no matter what it took. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and with a burst of engine noise, it sped off, leaving a trail of dust behind it. Michael and Robin stood for a moment, watching it disappear down the road. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us," Robin said softly, her eyes locked on Michael. "But we'll get the answers you need. We'll make sure your son gets justice." Michael nodded, his gaze distant. "I'll do whatever it takes. But I need to know, how did he survive? How did he manage to make that call?" His voice shook with emotion. "He's been through hell, Robin. He was chained to that radiator, starving, thirsty, and he still found a way to reach out for help. A kid his age, alone in that place. And he still fought. He's stronger than I ever realized." Robin's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "He's got you now, and you've got him." Michael felt a rush of gratitude for his partner, but the weight of the situation remained heavy on his shoulders. There were still too many questions, too many unknowns, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't fighting alone. He had a team, and more importantly, he had his son. As the officers continued to secure the area and investigate, Michael turned toward the ambulance, his mind already shifting gears. There was work to be done, and he would make sure that nothing was left unchecked. Whoever had done this to Nate would pay. They wouldn't get away with it. But in the quiet of the moment, as he stared at the ambulance fading into the distance, Michael allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. His son was alive. He was free. And no matter what it took, Michael would make sure that Nate never had to experience anything like this again. The road ahead was long, but it had just begun. The fight for justice. The hospital room felt sterile, cold even with the warmth of the afternoon sun filtering through the blinds. Michael stood beside the bed where Nate lay, hooked up to IVs and surrounded by a team of medical professionals working quickly but efficiently. The beeping of the heart monitor, the soft shuffle of nurses' feet on the tiled floor, and the steady rhythm of Nate's labored breathing were the only sounds in the room. Michael's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white, his body tense with a fury he could barely contain. He had done this before, watched someone he loved suffer, but this was different. This wasn't just any case. This was his son, the child he hadn't seen in 2 years, the boy whose life had been taken from him in an instant by circumstances beyond his control. Now here Nate was, his son, bruised and broken, with a spirit that refused to be extinguished. The physical damage was obvious. Bruises that covered his body, sunken cheeks that spoke of malnutrition, and his emaciated limbs that seemed too fragile to hold him upright. But the emotional toll, the trauma he had endured, the fear, the isolation, was something no doctor could see or treat with medicine. Michael glanced down at the small boy's face, his breath catching in his throat as he took in the hollow look in Nate's eyes. There was something about the way his son looked at him now, so different from the bright-eyed boy he remembered, that broke Michael's heart. The innocence, the trust, had been shattered in a way that no parent should ever have to witness. "How is he?" Michael's voice cracked slightly as he spoke to Dr. Emily Saunders, the attending physician who had been monitoring Nate's condition since he was brought in. Dr. Saunders, a woman in her mid-30s with a compassionate yet professional demeanor, looked up from her charts and nodded, though her expression remained grave. "He's stable for now, but he's in very bad shape. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, and a number of contusions all over his body. There are signs of long-term abuse. His muscles are atrophied from lack of movement, and he's been living in a state of constant fear for quite some time. He's been through more than any child should ever have to endure." Michael swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Will he recover?" Dr. Saunders hesitated, as though weighing her words carefully. "Physically, we'll get him back to health. It'll take time, months, maybe longer. But emotionally, that's going to be a harder battle. He's had his childhood stolen from him. We can help with the healing process, but the scars of trauma are something he'll carry with him for a long time." Michael's chest tightened with a pain so sharp it felt like a physical blow. He had known the road ahead would be difficult, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel all the more real. His son had been through hell, and it wasn't just the physical scars that would need to be healed. "He asked for me," Michael murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "When I found him in that house, he said, 'Daddy.' He remembered me." He looked at Dr. Saunders, his eyes wide with desperation. "Is that a good sign?" Dr. Saunders met his gaze with a soft, understanding look. "Yes, it is. It means he's still holding on to the love and security he once had. That's a positive sign. It means he trusts you, and that trust, no matter how fractured, can be the first step toward his recovery." The words were a small comfort, but Michael couldn't allow himself to relax just yet. There was so much more at stake here than Nate's physical recovery. He needed answers. He needed to know who was responsible for what had happened to his son and how someone could let this happen. A sense of deep, cold anger settled in his gut as he thought about it. Someone, some twisted individual, had put Nate through this, and Michael wasn't going to rest until he found out who and why. "Can I stay with him?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Saunders nodded, her eyes warm. "Of course. I'll let you know if anything changes." As the doctor and nurses left the room to give them some space, Michael sank into the chair next to Nate's bed. He gently brushed his son's hair back from his forehead, his hand trembling as he touched the boy's cool skin. Nate stirred slightly but didn't wake. His eyelids fluttered, and Michael held his breath, waiting for any sign of recognition. "Hey, buddy," Michael whispered softly, his voice cracking. "It's me, Dad. I'm right here." A faint sound escaped Nate's lips, something between a sigh and a whisper. His eyes opened slightly, the world seeming to spin around him as he fought to focus on his father's face. "Daddy," Nate whispered, his voice barely audible. His eyes locked on Michael, and for a brief moment, the fog of confusion lifted. Michael smiled through the tears threatening to fall. "Yeah, it's me, Nate," Michael said, his heart swelling with a combination of relief and sorrow. "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Nate's hand moved weakly, and Michael instinctively took it, squeezing it gently. He could feel his son's bones beneath the thin skin, and it took everything in him not to break down right there. He couldn't show his son his fear. Nate needed him to be strong. "I'm sorry, Dad," Nate mumbled, his eyes closing again, as though the effort to speak had drained what little energy he had left. Michael's heart shattered. "No, Nate. You have nothing to apologize for. You're not alone anymore." The weight of the situation hung over him like a storm cloud, dark and suffocating. He was angry, yes, furious even, but it was tempered with something deeper: guilt. He hadn't been there for Nate when it mattered the most. He hadn't fought hard enough during the divorce. He hadn't fought hard enough for his son's safety. And now, this was the result. The guilt gnawed at him. He had failed as a father. He wasn't there when his son needed him most. But now he would do everything in his power to make it right. Whatever it took, whatever price he had to pay, Michael would make sure this never happened again. No one would ever hurt Nate again. As Michael sat there, his mind raced. He couldn't just let this slide. The authorities needed to know the truth about what happened in that house, who had done this to his son, and why. He couldn't afford to be passive anymore. He had to take control, not just for Nate, but for every child who might be suffering the same way. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and Officer Robin Fisher stepped into the room, her face grim. She had been with Michael every step of the way, and he was grateful for her support, but there was something urgent in her expression now. "Michael, we've got a break in the case," Robin said, her voice low but steady. "We've identified the phone Nate used to call for help. We're pulling data from it now. We're going to find out who did this to him." Michael's pulse quickened, but he didn't dare allow himself to feel hope just yet. They had a long road ahead of them, and finding the person responsible was just the first step. He still had a million questions swirling in his mind. Why had Nate been kept in that house for so long? Who was behind it? "Do we know anything yet?" Michael asked, his voice tight with urgency. Robin hesitated, looking at Nate's fragile form. "Not yet, but we're working on it. We'll know more soon. And we got the team investigating the house. They're going through everything, anything that could point us to the person who did this." Michael nodded, his jaw clenched with determination. "Good. Make sure we get everything. No stone left unturned." He stood up, his hand still on Nate's, and walked to the window, staring out at the world that had moved on without him. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a small spark of hope ignite deep within him. He was going to fight for his son, and he would stop at nothing until he had the answers and justice that Nate deserved. But as he looked out at the horizon, a dark thought lingered in his mind. This fight, this battle for his son's future, was only just beginning, and Michael would be ready for whatever came next. The ties that bind. The weeks that followed Nate's rescue passed in a blur of hospital visits, legal proceedings, and constant uncertainty. Michael spent every moment he could by his son's side, even as the medical team worked tirelessly to nurse Nate back to health. The boy's physical recovery was slow, each day revealing a little more strength, a little more resilience, but it was the emotional scars that were the hardest to witness. Nate had always been quiet, introspective, even as a child, but now his silence seemed to carry a weight that Michael could hardly bear. He would often stare out of the hospital window, his small body curled up under the sterile sheets, lost in a world of his own. When he did speak, it was in hushed tones, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile reality they were trying to rebuild. Michael did everything he could to bridge the chasm that had formed between them. He would sit with Nate for hours, telling him stories of when he was little, when they used to play catch in the backyard or go on weekend hikes to the mountains. Anything to spark a memory, to remind his son of a time when the world didn't seem so cruel. But there were times when Michael could see the hurt in Nate's eyes, the confusion, the fear, and the pain of memories that Michael could never fully understand. His son had been through hell, and even now, as the hospital walls closed in around them, Michael felt helpless, unable to shield him from the trauma that would forever shape who he was. Nate's recovery was just as much about healing the mind as it was about healing the body, and Michael understood that all too well. His son's spirit had been battered, but it hadn't been broken. Not yet. One afternoon, as Michael sat by Nate's side, gently brushing his fingers through his son's messy hair, the door to the room opened, and Officer Robin Fisher stepped inside. She had been an unwavering ally throughout this entire ordeal, offering both emotional support and the strength of her experience. She had always been more than just a partner on the job. She was a friend. And right now, Michael needed her more than ever. "Hey," Robin said softly, her eyes scanning the room before settling on Michael. "How's he doing today?" Michael looked up from Nate's sleeping form, his face etched with exhaustion and concern. "Better than yesterday, but it's still a struggle. He doesn't talk much, Robin. Hardly at all. He's so distant. I don't know how to reach him." Robin nodded, her expression thoughtful. "He'll come around. It's just going to take time. He's been through more than any child should ever have to bear. But you're here. That's the most important thing." Michael sighed, rubbing his eyes. "I'm trying, but I don't know how to fix this. I can't just erase everything that's happened to him. I can't make it go away." Robin walked over and pulled up a chair beside him, settling down with a soft sigh. "You're doing the right thing by being here, by staying with him. That's more than most people would do." Michael looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet, desperate pain. "I don't even know where to start. I can't change the past. I can't take away the hurt. All I can do is promise him that I'll make sure no one ever hurts him again. But sometimes, Robin, I feel like I'm failing him." "You're not failing him," Robin said firmly. "You're doing the best you can. You're showing him that you're here, that you love him, that he's not alone. That's all he needs right now." Michael took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. It was hard to listen to Robin's comforting words and truly believe them. He could feel his own guilt, his own fear gnawing at him. There were so many things he wished he had done differently. But now, as he looked at his son, there was no time to dwell on the past. It was time to focus on the present, and on finding out who had done this to Nate. "Any updates on the investigation?" Michael asked, his voice low but filled with purpose. Robin hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward, her voice just as serious as his. "We've made progress. We've traced the phone that Nate used to make the call. It came from a burner phone, and it was a real challenge to track down the owner. But we're close. There's a connection to someone in the neighborhood, someone who was known to have had access to the house." Michael's pulse quickened at the news. "Do you have a name? Who's responsible for this?" Robin nodded, her jaw clenched. "We're working on it. But there's something else. We think the person responsible may have ties to your ex-wife." The words hit Michael like a slap in the face. He stared at Robin, disbelief flickering in his eyes. "Sarah, how is she involved in this? What the hell does she have to do with this?" Robin's gaze softened, but there was no denying the gravity of what she was saying. "We've uncovered some things during our investigation. Financial transactions, communication with someone who had access to that house, and it looks like Sarah may have known more than she let on. We don't have all the answers yet, but there's a strong possibility that she's been involved in some capacity." Michael's mind reeled. His first instinct was to deny it, to push it away. But the evidence was starting to stack up, and he knew better than to ignore it. He had spent years building his life apart from Sarah, trying to forget the pain and betrayal that came with their divorce. He had tried to move on, but now, this new revelation forced him to confront everything he had tried to bury. "Are you telling me that Sarah was part of this?" Michael asked, his voice strained. "That she knew what was happening to Nate and didn't do anything to stop it?" Robin's face was somber. "We're not sure yet, but it's looking that way. We're digging deeper into her connections, trying to figure out where she fits in all of this. But if she knew and did nothing, that's a whole new level of betrayal." Michael felt his chest tighten, the weight of the situation suffocating him. He had always believed in his son's innocence, always believed that he would never have been put in harm's way if Sarah had been a better mother. But now, the possibility that Sarah had played a role in this, it was unthinkable. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. "I need to see her," he said, his voice low and determined. "I need to confront her. I need to know the truth." Robin placed a hand on his arm, her grip firm but compassionate. "I understand. But right now, the most important thing is Nate. We're not going to let anything happen to him. And if we need to bring Sarah in for questioning, we'll do it the right way. Let us handle the investigation. You need to focus on being there for Nate." Michael looked at his son, still sleeping in the bed, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. He knew Robin was right. This wasn't the time for confrontation. He had to be patient, even if it tore him apart to think about what Sarah might have known. He couldn't let anger cloud his judgment. Not now. Not when Nate needed him more than ever. "You're right," Michael said quietly, his voice hoarse. "But once Nate is better, we'll find the truth. And when we do, there will be no escaping it." Robin nodded, understanding the resolve in Michael's tone. She knew this wasn't just about finding the person responsible for Nate's suffering. It was about holding everyone accountable, including the people Michael had once loved. "I'll make sure we get answers, Michael," Robin said, her voice steady. "I promise." For the first time in weeks, Michael felt a flicker of something inside him, a spark of hope, fueled by the determination to protect his son. He had failed in the past, but he wouldn't fail again. Not now. Not ever. As the silence of the hospital room enveloped them, Michael's gaze remained fixed on Nate's fragile form. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Michael knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened, he would never let anyone hurt his son again. This fight, this battle for justice, was just beginning, and Michael would stand by Nate's side every step of the way. The reckoning. The days that followed the revelation about Sarah's potential involvement in Nate's abuse were filled with a whirlwind of emotions, decisions, and mounting pressure. Michael found himself in a constant state of conflict. His mind raced with questions, doubts, and fears, but above all, the one thing he couldn't stop thinking about was his son. Nate's recovery was slow, painstakingly so, but there were moments of progress. The quiet, withdrawn child he had been in the hospital was gradually starting to show signs of trust, of hope, however small. Michael had decided to stay at Nate's side as much as possible. He knew that he couldn't change what had happened to his son, but he could be there for him now. His presence, his steady hand, was the only anchor Nate seemed to trust. Every time Nate opened his eyes, Michael was there, offering him comfort in a world that had been nothing but a nightmare for too long. But even as the bond between father and son deepened, Michael knew that the real battle was just beginning. The deeper they dug into the investigation, the more unsettling the truths seemed to become. Sarah, his ex-wife, the woman he had once loved, had been hiding something, and the possibility that she was involved in Nate's torment gnawed at Michael's soul. The police had gathered enough evidence to bring her in for questioning, but Michael knew the process would be slow. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and they had yet to prove her involvement beyond a shadow of a doubt. Still, every day that passed without answers felt like a betrayal. Nate deserved to know the truth, and Michael had promised him that no one would get away with what had been done to him. It was early one afternoon when Michael received the call. It wasn't from Robin. It wasn't from any officer working on the case. It was from Sarah. "Michael," her voice crackled through the phone, a sound he hadn't heard in years. Her voice was tired, strained. There was no hint of warmth, no attempt at familiarity, just a hollow tone of someone who knew they were on the verge of being exposed. "Sarah," Michael said, his voice flat. "What do you want?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Finally, she spoke, her words slow, deliberate. "I need to see Nate." Michael's heart skipped a beat. His immediate response was to refuse, but something in the way she said it, held him back. "You're not welcome here, Sarah," he said firmly, though there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "Not after everything that's happened." "You don't understand," Sarah said quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't know, Michael. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know." Michael's hands tightened around the phone. He wanted to lash out, to yell at her, to tell her how much damage she had caused to their family. But he held back. For Nate's sake, he had to stay calm. He had to stay in control. "You didn't know." Michael's voice was incredulous. "How could you not know, Sarah? How could you not see what was happening to him? He was your son, too." There was a long pause. He could hear her breathing on the other end, but she didn't speak for a long time. Finally, she muttered, "I was too wrapped up in my own mess. I didn't see it, Michael. I didn't want to see it." Michael's mind spun with the weight of her words. There was something in her voice that sounded almost regretful. But Michael knew better than to buy into it. Regret didn't change what had happened. It didn't undo the years of pain, the years of neglect. "I can't let you see him," Michael said firmly, his voice thick with emotion. "Not until I know the truth. Not until I know where you stand in all of this. You don't get to waltz back into his life like nothing happened." Another long pause. "I'll come clean, Michael," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll tell you everything. But I need to see Nate. I need to tell him I'm sorry. I need him to understand that I never meant for this to happen." Michael didn't answer right away. His heart pounded in his chest, torn between the desire to protect Nate and the hope that Sarah might be telling the truth. He couldn't be sure, not yet. Not after everything. "I'll think about it," he finally said, his voice cold. "But don't think you can use guilt to get to him. You've lost that privilege." The call ended, leaving Michael standing alone in the silence of his apartment. He hadn't wanted to hear her voice again, but now that he had, it was all too clear. Sarah was hiding something. It was in the way she had spoken, in the way she had pleaded for forgiveness without ever admitting the full truth. Michael wasn't ready to trust her. Not yet. But something in the back of his mind gnawed at him. Maybe there was more to the story. Maybe there was something he was missing. He couldn't ignore the possibility that Sarah had been manipulated, that she hadn't known the full extent of the abuse Nate had suffered. Though that was a hard pill to swallow. Days passed, and Nate's condition continued to improve. The bruises that marred his body were beginning to fade, and his appetite returned in small, hesitant steps. But there was still a long way to go. There was still so much to repair. The emotional wounds, the shattered trust, would take years to heal, if they ever truly did. But then, one night, something changed. Michael had just left the hospital after another long shift, his mind weary from the constant worry. He had been so focused on keeping Nate safe, on ensuring that everything would be all right, that he hadn't realized how much strain it was putting on him. He hadn't realized how much of himself he had been giving up. As he approached his apartment, the flickering streetlights outside his building cast long shadows across the pavement. He reached for his keys, his hand trembling slightly from fatigue. But as he turned the corner to his apartment, he saw a figure standing by his door. It was Sarah. "What are you doing here?" Michael asked, his voice sharp as he approached her. His heart raced, unsure whether this was another attempt to manipulate him or if she was genuinely trying to make amends. Sarah looked up, her face pale, her eyes tired. "I need to talk, Michael. I need to make this right. For Nate. For you." Michael's gut twisted with suspicion. "This is the last time you get to do this, Sarah. You don't get to walk back into our lives after everything that's happened." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "But please, just hear me out. I've made mistakes, and I'll have to live with them for the rest of my life. But I was never part of what happened to Nate. I swear to you." Michael's mind whirled as he took in her words, but deep down, he wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Was this the woman he had once married, the woman who had promised to love and protect their son, or was this just another lie to save herself? "I'm not sure I can believe you," Michael said, his voice strained, but unwilling to listen. He stepped aside, letting Sarah into his apartment, but every instinct inside him was on edge. Something wasn't right, and as Sarah began to speak, Michael knew that the truth, the full, terrifying truth, was about to come to light. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, and he was finally ready to face whatever came next.